Hello parents, this video is to help you review what your Fix-It teacher's manual looks like and how best to help your student throughout the week as they are working on their grammar. I know that Fix-It can at times be very overwhelming. It can also be sometimes hard to teach out of this book, but what I wanted to let you know is that this is one of the best programs to help prepare your student for high school and beyond, especially when it comes to ACT prep, which they will all have to do down the road. So I know it might seem like ACT prep, that's years away, and that might be true, but understanding these fundamentals and getting into some of the more advanced rules in grammar are going to be very important, because once they hit high school and they start preparing for that ACT prep, you don't want them starting at zero. You don't want them starting from behind the curve. So with that said, I wanted to help you better understand how best to utilize this curriculum. So first, we'll just look over the Learn It section. So the Learn It section here, as you can see, you have several different areas. Now, you guys have probably already been working on this for the last few weeks, so if you know all about this, then you can just ignore this part of the video. But up here, what we have is we have the Learn It section. Right below that, so this is, the header is basically telling you these are the concepts that we're going to be reviewing this week, and these are probably the concepts that you're going to be seeing in the passages that week. Now, there are sometimes exceptions to that rule. There's actually in week 4 or 5 a section about illegal number 4 openers, and that's something that's really good to know, especially for as your students are writing, but it's not something that they're actually going to see in their passages as they're doing their daily corrections. And that is something that I did tell them in class. So from this section that you can see here, up top you have your what's listed for grammar cards. These are the grammar cards that they will need for that particular week. That will build throughout the year, and so they need their grammar cards every single time they are working on their daily corrections, and then every time that they come to class. That's incredibly important, because there are going to be a lot of times where I let them use their grammar cards and notes for tests and quizzes. The next section that you'll see are the grammar notations. So in this case, this is telling you how to help you see how sentences are construction. Mark the sentence as follows. And so this is something that you'll see in these first few weeks when they're just getting used to marking the daily corrections. Below that is some of the part of the rules that they were talking about, the commas, and then of course the dress ups down here. So let's look at a different week, something that's a little further that maybe you guys are dealing with right now. So currently your students should be working on week 5, and we did day 1 in class this week. And so this is what I was talking about, where you'll see the illegal number 4 openers. Now, I looked through up to, I think, week 15, and there was never a time where they needed to be looking out for an illegal 4 opener. But what we did talk about in class were sentences that made sense in run-ons, whether or not we should use a comma and a coordinating conjunction, or if it's better and more logical to just split it into 2 sentences. So that's the explanation given here, and then below that is the explanation for illegal number 4 openers. So over here you have a little section that is basically just giving you some advice on what you should be helping your student do, and continuing to tell them to have them mark their subjects and verbs and clauses and discuss with them the ones that they missed. And so a lot of practicing recognizing subjects and verbs will help students in many, many, many ways with punctuation and with grammar. Now, something that will be in the other video that I give you guys, which is actually going through an entire day and what I do with your students, is that you're always looking for prepositional phrases first. By doing that, you're getting rid of nouns that can easily be mistaken as the subject of that verb. So you always want to make sure that you're getting the right action word and not accidentally marking an infinitive, and then making sure that you're getting the right subject and not accidentally marking just a noun that happens to be part of a prepositional phrase, or that's the direct object, or so on and so forth. So that's what your Learn It sections are going to look like. Now, as you can see here, this is the corrections that it should look like that your student has done for that day. And then you have all of this information down here. Now, all of this information can be incredibly overwhelming, especially if you're not looking at grammar every single day. You're not steeped in it. You're not teaching it necessarily. This isn't your field, and I completely understand that. This is stuff that we learn, and then you just kind of know. Sometimes you'll make grammar mistakes. Sometimes we won't get punctuation or commas right when we're writing in our professional lives. So because we're not looking at what those rules are all the time, a lot of this lingo can be incredibly confusing, and then you're just overwhelmed. So what I wanted you to know, though, is that as you're going through this, these fixes are not necessarily in the order in which they should do them. Something that I had told your students, and that's also in the other video going over the entire day, is that they start with prepositional phrases, then they look for their action words or their verbs, then they find their subjects, then they move on to clauses, then they go on and move to the different punctuation, commas, changing sentences back into multiple sentences rather than one long run-on sentence. Perhaps in some cases moving a clause from one place to another. That does not happen often. It happens every once in a while. And then after that, any other additional word misusage, something that has to be changed. You'll see that up here, like with the she was. This was a subject-verb agreement issue. This was a noun-pronoun tense issue. So, if you have more questions about that, we went over it in detail in class, and then there's an explanation about pronoun agreement up here. So making sure that the noun is singular, and then any pronouns that it's referring back to are also the same tense. That are both the same tense and are either singular or plural. A lot of information. So this is listed in fixes and then other grammar notations. So you have your prepositional phrases and your clauses. Now, something that is in this book, in book 4, is that it only has them underline prepositional phrases up to week 10. Now, I have told your students that will not be the case with this book. You guys, they will continue to underline their prepositional phrases all the way through the book. And even though they won't be underlined in your corrections, they will still be listed down here. So if you can still check them, even though the book has not underlined them. But that is definitely something that you want to have them continue to do, because it's going to go a long way to helping them understand how to notate all of these passages. Okay, the last thing that I want you to look at in here with me is if you go all the way to the back of the book, you will, after week 32, you will have some info. You will have this scope and sequence chart. So this is telling you every week the different concepts that they are actually going through. Now, the column with vocabulary, we're not really paying attention to those words this year. We're really only taking vocab out of the classical roots C. It's good that these words are here. It's good that they look at those definitions, but what they're actually being tested on is out of vocabulary book C. Those are already going to give them approximately 15 words a week, and that's enough. I don't want to have to add another additional 4 and then have them trying memorizing and remembering all of those sentences. I think 15 is definitely enough. So you can ignore the vocabulary column, but these other columns here, the parts of speech, punctuation, style, and other concepts, that will give you a very broad look at what they're going to be working on over the next several weeks. And something that I talked to your students about, and then I also put in the email last week, was that because of just seeing what the students needed and additional work that they might need, that we are going to be looking at some fundamentals and basics. We did that this last week, looking at nouns and prepositions. Prepositions are incredibly important. I did tell all of your students that in their next quiz, that's going to be on week 6, that they will have a quiz on prepositions and they will need to be able to list them without any help. It's incredibly important that, yes, I will be letting them use their grammar cards for many things, but they need to memorize those prepositions. That's like step 1 of being able to do this now and beyond. Okay, the next thing that I want you to see in it is that after you have that scope and sequence chart, there is a Fix-It glossary in the back of your book. And I definitely don't want you to get to the end of the year and be like, oh my goodness, I had no idea that was in there. This is a huge, huge lifesaver right here, this glossary. So I will show you. Right here in the very beginning, you have your contents page, and it has everything. It's got parts of speech, sentences, clauses, and phrases, punctuation, all the other additional rules and concepts, and then all of the stylistic techniques. Especially these are great for their IEW class. There is absolutely no reason that they should not be able to utilize this for both classes. It's incredibly important. Now, you have this glossary in the back of your teacher's manual, but they also have the glossary in the back of the spiral-bound student notebook. Now, don't worry, for those of you who have the digital copy, who are printing off the sheets every week, there is a glossary in that as well as the grammar cards. So just because you have it in a PDF form doesn't mean that your student doesn't have access to it. So if you can, it would be good for you to print that off for them. If printing it off is too much, that they at least have access while they're doing their daily corrections, because whereas the cards are great and necessary and needed and definitely need them in class, this glossary goes into lots of detail on those individual concepts. If they're like, gosh, what was the rule for proper nouns and capitalization? Well, if you've got a question about that, they're right here at the beginning. If they forget what editing marks they need to use and they can't find them on their card, they're right here. So right here at the beginning, parts of speech, you've got articles, nouns, and then it goes into all of the explanations as to what these are. So anything that is a concept that's talked about in the Learn It section, you have a little space there that's giving a small explanation as to what that concept is. But in your glossary, it goes into a lot more detail. So, and then it will also give you some additional examples that are not necessarily in your Learn It section. So, and then all of the concepts that Fix-It assumes you already know, all of that is in here. So something that we talked about this week were prepositions and what their function is, how they are used in a prepositional phrase, and how better we can identify them. So right here at the top of the preposition section, what it's talking about is that prepositions start phrases that usually show some relationship dealing with space, on the branch, around the tree, on the log, or time, in the morning, at night, and so on and so forth. And so the other thing that we really honed in on was that a prepositional phrase is a preposition plus a noun with no verb. It is so important that they get that they know a prepositional phrase is a preposition plus a noun with no verb. So what is really, really, really important is that since there is not a subject or verb, it is a phrase, not a clause, there may be other words in between the preposition and noun, because remember, you're going to have preposition first and then a noun. There will never be a verb. So you will have sometimes additional words. So in the act. So in being the preposition, act being the noun, and the an article. By a great baron. By the being the preposition, baron being the noun, so we have preposition, noun. A great, so a being the article, great being an adjective. You can have other words in the prepositional phrase as long as there's no verb and you start with the preposition and end with a noun. I'm trying to see if there are. Something else that your students will, that I have found most students really struggle with is being able to identify clauses. So the rule for clauses is that a clause will always contain a subject and a verb. So say you have a passage, and in that passage you have found 5 verbs and 5 subjects. So those subject and verb pairings are going to be in a clause. So if you have 5 subject and verb pairings, you will have 5 clauses. That's always how it works. So if that is the case, then they got to be able to determine where the clause begins and ends, and then what kind of clause it is. Is it a main clause? Is it a dependent clause? And then later down the road, is it an adverbial clause? And so there is a lot of explanation in here about that and about how best to identify those clauses. So something that I will tell you guys that should, I think, really help is that, so like we said, a clause is a group of related words that must have both a subject and a verb. But the other part is that main clauses can stand alone as a sentence, and that they usually start with a subject or with an article or adjective plus the subject. So the subject's going to be right up there at the beginning of the clause. That is usually how it starts. So if we see that, then we can a lot of the time identify a main clause pretty easily. Now sometimes the subject verb will be inverted with the verb coming before the subject. An example would be, there gathered around him displaced countrymen. So the subject verb is countrymen gathered. So sometimes you will see those inverted, but more often than not, you will have the subject and then the verb. Now, it's best to find the verb first because then we can ask those questions of who or what is doing that action. Then dependent clauses are basically main clauses with another word in front that turns the main clause into something that leaves us hanging. And we can usually identify dependent clauses based on either being who, which clauses, or being part of the www.asia.b, and then later we will add some additional words to that. But if they remember that www.asia.b, then they will be able to identify those dependent clauses a little bit better. So a lot of the time, students get really frustrated with clauses, and they just guess. They just guess. And they're like, I think it starts here and ends there, main clause. So if they can remember those rules about how those clauses start, then it will really help them down the road to be able to better identify them. Clauses should not be something that create panic, and that tends to be what happens, especially when they're taking a quiz or a test, and then they forget how to identify them. So if they can remember that, and again, like I said, all of that is here in the glossary to help you understand and help them understand better how to make those corrections and how to identify those notations. Now, there is more information in here about dependent clauses when it comes to adverb clauses and adjective clauses. What I have told your students, what I will tell you right now, what we are most concerned with at the moment Later in the year, we'll deal with it, but at the moment, I just want them to be able to identify the difference between a main clause and a dependent clause. But even with all of that said, right now, especially for the rest of this quarter and maybe into a little bit of the second quarter, we are going to be looking and focusing at the fundamentals. So this week we looked at nouns, we looked at prepositions. Next week we'll probably do one more additional sheet on nouns. Now prepositions are going to be throughout the rest of the year. They're going to see that continually. But then we'll start looking at verbs. We'll start looking at infinitives, because infinitives very, very, very frequently get confused for prepositional phrases. So I want them to be able to see and identify what the difference is between all of that. So we are going to be focusing on the basics. I don't want anyone to be lost. I don't want anyone sitting there in class thinking, I have no idea what this woman is saying. I just wish she would stop. Now, they usually feel that way anyway because they're 7th and 8th graders and they're at school. So, But when it comes to grammar, I want them to have all the resources available to do the absolute best that they can, because my whole goal is preparing them for beyond this. Not just for high school, but for for higher education and on. This is something that should not be something that they dread and that's a panic. By the time they are able to take the ACT, even if it's not something that they are stellar at, if they get some of these basics and get the fundamentals, it will make all the difference in the world. Again, like I said in my other video, if there is something else that you would like to go over, or you would like to sit down one-on-one, I'm willing to do so. I can meet with parents outside of class, or we can meet at the end of the day after, when you guys come pick up. Whatever works, so that you and I are on the same page and that you feel better about being able to utilize this curriculum. So I hope this helps. If you have any feedback or have any other questions, please let me know.